Renee, Mary Margaret. The two stylishly dressed young women squealed and rushed to hug each other as the hostess at the restaurant watched in amusement. When they finished greeting one another, she led them to a table at the rear of the cafe. Even though it was still May, temperatures in Houston had already climbed to the high 80s, and the matching humidity made air conditioning a necessity. I wonder how many hours in the gym it takes to get figures like they have. The hostess mused enviously as she seated her patrons. I was so glad to get your call, Mary Margaret, the shorter blonde woman gushed. It's been ages since you've gotten down here. I know, the tall brunette replied. Starting my own ad agency has taken way more time than I ever imagined. To be honest, I wouldn't be here today if I wasn't calling on a potential client. But since I did, I couldn't pass up a chance to see my old college roomie. Yeah, and I couldn't miss seeing my maid of honor again. It's been too long, girlfriend. Their waiter interrupted them with 2 glasses of white wine, and after he'd taken their lunch orders, Mary Margaret cocked her head and asked, So how's the legal profession treating you? A big smile came over Renee's face. It's awesome. Baker, Norton Vincent is the biggest law firm in the city. I'm making a great salary plus a massive bonus last year, and I'm well on my way to becoming a partner. Wow, and I thought I was doing well. Sorry, I didn't mean to brag. But what about you? How's your agency doing? The brunette smiled coyly. Well, as long as we're bragging here, my little agency is the hot creative shop in Dallas. In fact, she said in a lower tone, last night I signed a deal to handle all the advertising for the Southwest region of one of the big oil companies. Our billings to them next year will be in the millions. Renee nodded in approval. I always knew you were going to be a star, girl. The two ate their salads in silence for a few minutes. Then Renee glanced curiously at her friend. You haven't said anything about romance. How's your love life? Mary Margaret sighed. Frankly, there's nothing much to talk about. The dating scene is getting pretty tiresome. Those dating services are useless. I'd have better luck finding a unicorn than someone like your attractive husband. She noted the way Renee's eyes darted away momentarily. Hey, what's going on, roomie? Are you and your husband having troubles? Now the blonde woman was obviously uncomfortable. She heaved a sigh, took a swig from her wine glass, and then looked up at her friend. I've been dying to tell someone, Mary Margaret, but you've got to promise to keep this strictly confidential. Of course. Now tell me what's going on. Renee took a deep breath and then burst out in a low whisper. I'm having an emotional connection with someone else. Really? I'm shocked. I thought you and Robert were the perfect couple. She leaned closer. What happened? Isn't the relationship any good? Renee shook her head dismissively. No, that's not the problem. She shrugged her shoulders. Why? Mary Margaret sat back in her chair, surprised at the vehemence of her friend's pronouncement. You remember I told you about that opportunity Robert had to become his old company's chief counsel, and then how it fell through? That was disappointing enough, but now he's decided to hang out his shingle and go into practice for himself. Her friend frowned. If he's that passionate about the law, why not go for it? Sounds like a pretty bold move to me. You wouldn't say that if you saw him. It's pathetic he's working out of a tiny office he rents in a rundown strip mall. He hardly bills enough hours to cover his expenses, much less bring anything home. I'm the one who's supporting us. Mary Margaret raised one eyebrow. I seem to remember he was doing the same thing for you while you were finishing law school. Renee shook her head impatiently. Yeah, but that was different. I knew that I'd succeed as soon as I graduated, and I have. She frowned. But Robert is just beating his head against the wall. His law office isn't going to turn out any different than all the other lawyers out there, chasing ambulances to drum up business. Mary Margaret sat silently, digesting her lunch and her friend's revelation. After a few moments, she took another sip of wine and looked inquiringly at her friend. So who is the other person in your life? Renee leaned forward and whispered, It's my boss at Baker Norton. He's already a partner, and the word in the hallways is he's all set to become a senior partner when old man Baker retires. Sounds like you're aiming high. How long has this connection been going on? I guess about 6 months now. But listen, it's about more than just romance. He really cares about me. He wants to spend the rest of his life with me. Him. So you both have an inconvenient spouse. Yeah, but Vance has a prenup with his, so ending the marriage won't be too complicated for him. And what about you and Robert? Are you going to separate from him? Renee's face soured. That's the problem. We never even thought about a prenup. As things are now, If we split, I'd probably wind up paying alimony to Robert, and I won't stand for that. I have no intention of continuing to financially support his struggling little law firm forever. Mary Margaret shook her head. You know you're taking a risk, girlfriend. Texas doesn't have a no-fault divorce policy. If he catches you two together, there could be serious consequences for you. Renee looked at her friend in exasperation. Refresh my memory which one of us has the law degree. Then she smiled to take the sting out of her sarcasm. Anyway, I'll figure something out. 3 weeks later, unfortunately, I didn't learn about my wife's conversation until much later, too late to do anything about it. All I knew for sure that May morning was that neither my personal nor my professional life was going the way I'd planned it. I was in a gloomy mood when I pulled into the little strip mall and parked my car in one of my allotted spaces at the curb. As I locked the car door, I noticed a for lease sign plastered across the window of one of the stores at the other end of the center. Wasn't that where that little crafts and candles store was? Damn, I guess they didn't make it. I shook my head, hoping a similar fate wasn't in store for my legal practice. Walking up to the door to my office, I brushed my fingers over the sign affixed to the wall. Robert L. Wilson, Esquire, attorney at law. The sign was plastic, but it looked a little like bronze. Maybe someday I'll have one etched in marble. Everything was quiet inside, but then it was 7 a.m., so what did I expect? I'd always been in the habit of getting to work early, no reason to change now. I checked my phone, but no prospective clients had left any messages. I sighed and slumped down in my chair. Reaching into my desk drawer, I pulled out a folder of paperwork on a contract I was preparing for a client. It was pretty straightforward, but there was no reason not to check it over again, just to be sure. After a few minutes, however, I dropped my pen on the desk and leaned back in my chair with a sigh. If only things had worked out at Allied. I'd been working as the operations manager at Allied Fluid Dynamics, a major regional supplier of components for oil and gas pipelines. I was doing well, making good money, and in line to take on greater responsibilities. Then Ben Masterson, the company president, called me into his office with an interesting proposition. Robert, Phil Larson came to see me yesterday. He wanted to give me advance notice that he's planning to retire in a few years, and that Allied will be needing to find a new general counsel. I hadn't heard that bit of news. Phil was a little old school in his dress and manners, but he kept the company's legal affairs on the straight and narrow, not always an easy task in the rough and tumble oil industry. He and I weren't close, but I respected him. Ben wasn't through. Phil also had a little advice for me. He told me we had 3 options for replacing him. The first would be to outsource everything, turn all our legal work over to some outside law firm. If we do that, he told me, it'll cost us a fortune, and it will take them at least 2 or 3 years to learn the business well enough to become effective. The second option he suggested was hiring some sharp attorney and teaching him the business. That won't be easy to do, and once again, there'll be a long learning curve. Finally, Phil said, we could find someone in-house who knows our business inside and out and send him to law school. I nodded. You know, Ben, that last option actually makes a lot of sense. Our business is pretty unique. I bet it would take less time to learn to practice law. Ben grinned at me. I hoped you would say that, because the guy Phil recommended was you. Me? I'm an operations manager. I could never do what Phil does. That's not what Phil thinks. He told me he thought you'd be perfect, said you had an affinity for the law. Ben must have read the look on my face because he stopped me before I could object. Of course, the company would pay all tuition and expenses for your education. We'd want you to take courses at night and keep things together in operations. It would be a lot to tackle, but if you do it, you'll be walking into a top-level management job at a lot younger age than you could reasonably expect otherwise. What do you think? I think I owe Bill Larson a punch in the mouth. I shot back with a laugh. Seriously, Ben, this is not something I've ever even thought about. No matter what, I need to go home and talk it over with my wife. He couldn't argue with that, so I went home and told Reen about the opportunity. To my surprise, she was all for it. This is great, Han, she enthused. You'll jump shift out of that boring middle management job and straight into the executive suite. And if they put you on the board of directors like Phil, you'll probably get some major stock options. Maybe, but this would put me way outside my comfort zone. The idea of going back to school is pretty daunting. Oh, don't worry about that. You're plenty smart enough to handle the coursework. And besides, you'll really only have to focus on contracts and regulations, definitely no criminal law. Anyway, I've just been through all that stuff, so I can help you if you get stuck. Come on, Han, but this is the chance of a lifetime. You've got to do it. All right, if you're up for it, so am I. Wonderful, she exclaimed. My friends will be so jealous. And thus I began my legal career. When I registered for the University of Houston Law Center's part-time program, I found out I'd be going year-round for 4 years. I'd be attending courses at night, taking 10 credits per semester, all while keeping up my work at Allied. Plus, Masterson told me I'd have to find and train a successor to take over my operations job. It was a tough workload, and there were times when I questioned my sanity. All too often, I got by on too little sleep and too much coffee. Even worse, I had almost no time to spend with Renee. As it turned out, that was going to happen anyway. When she graduated from law school, Renee had been hired by Baker, Norton & Vinson, the biggest law firm in Houston. She was now working as many hours per week as I was, including my schoolwork. There were weeks when we saw each other for only a couple of hours, but every time we did, we agreed that the pain and separation would all be worth it in the end. Despite my doubts and occasional burnout, I made it through, and the pride I felt on graduation day was proof I'd made the right decision. Of course, there was still one more hurdle: the bar exam. So the Monday after graduation, I was back in the classroom preparing for the grueling 12-hour-long test over 2 days. 3 months later, I was overjoyed to see my name on the list of those who'd passed. When Ben Masterson called me into his office the following Monday, I was excited and eager to take on my new duties. Yet despite my excitement, I couldn't help noticing Ben's serious expression when I sat down in front of his desk. "Robert," he said in a solemn voice, "I don't know any other way to handle this except to tell you straight out. Over the weekend, the board of directors met and voted to accept an offer from Kinder Morgan to acquire us. They want to move forward with the takeover right away. So next week, Allied will become their fully owned subsidiary." I was shocked I hadn't heard even a whisper of such a possibility. What does this mean for all of us? I'm going to retire, and so are most of the other directors. By next week, KM will have a new management team here to take over day-to-day operations. I gripped the edge of his desk to steady myself. How will this affect my role? He couldn't look me in the eye. "I'm sorry, Robert. Kinder Morgan subsidiaries don't have their own legal counsel. I thought about the bright-eyed engineer I'd been grooming to succeed me. And she just got married. I can't do that, Ben. Not after the last 4 years. Keep Stearns and let me go." "I thought you might say that, Robert." He shook his head sadly. "This merger is going to be good for the company and a lot of our people, but not everyone. I'm really sorry." He stood up to let me know the meeting was over. "If you'll go see HR, they'll help you make all the arrangements." He held out his hand, and I reluctantly shook it. "I really am sorry, Robert. This is not what I envisioned when we set out on this path 4 years ago." And just like that, I was unemployed. They gave me 6 months severance pay and benefits. But that was pretty tough when I thought about my great expectations. Renee was devastated when I told her the news. "How can they do that to you, especially after all the extra hours you put in at their request?" "It's just not fair." I agreed, but there was nothing I could say to make her or myself feel any better. It was just business, and I was just collateral damage. "Are you going to start looking for work in the petroleum industry?" she asked. "You've still got a lot of contacts there, don't you?" "Not anymore. I've been so buried in law school that I've lost touch with a lot of my old colleagues. Besides, the price of crude oil has taken a real hit this year, so there's not a lot of hiring going on. Then what are you going to do?" "I didn't spend the last 4 years of my life in law school just to throw it away. I'm going to start looking for legal jobs." "Don't be silly, hon. Baker, Norton wouldn't hire you, they only take new grads. The other big firms are the same way. Unless you've got special legal expertise or some major clients to bring with you, your chances of joining one of them are pretty slim." "Then I'll start my own firm if I have to," I said stubbornly. She let the conversation die, probably hoping I'd drop the idea once I'd had a chance to think it over. But 2 weeks later, when she learned I'd used my severance check to sign a lease on office space in a strip mall, she became openly negative. "That place is not good enough, Robert. You'll never build up a good clientele working at that address. You just watch me," I vowed. Looking back, I think that's when our marriage really started going downhill. Renee tried to hide her dismay at my ambitious plan, but she openly resented taking on a larger share of our living expenses. I didn't like it either, but I couldn't convince her that the situation was temporary. Moreover, she was clearly embarrassed when friends and colleagues asked about my endeavor. She'd talk about it only vaguely and quickly change the subject. It was difficult to get her to provide my new office address. Our friends were sympathetic, but it was easy to hear the hesitation in their voices. As a result, I isolated myself more and more so I could avoid the inevitable "how's the practice going?" questions. Reina's career, on the other hand, continued to flourish. She was billing more and more hours and taking on major clients. Whenever we ran into people from Baker Norton, all they wanted to talk about was how well Renee was doing and how likely she was to become a partner. This meant that we weren't feeling any financial pressure despite my loss of income. On the other hand, her success mixed with her resentment towards me resulted in her spending more and more time at the office. And that was the state of things in late May when Hurricane Matty hit. I had been reviewing one of my few active cases when I heard the front door open. I hurried out of my office to see a young, well-dressed African-American woman. She looked to be in her early 20s, and the jacket and skirt she wore showed off her slim, athletic figure. I remember wondering if she might have been an athlete in college, but the most striking thing about her was her hair. She wore it long and natural, and it hung down below her shoulders, framing her pretty face in beautiful dark waves. Please let her be a paying client, I thought as I introduced myself and led her into my simple office. When we were seated, I put on my most professional expression and said, "Now, how can I assist you today, MS?" She promptly reached across the desk to shake hands with me, and her face lit up with a smile that brightened the room. "I'm Madison Armstrong, but everyone calls me Maddie. I'm not looking for your help, I'm here to help you." Before I could respond, she handed me a folder of papers she had brought with her and pushed it toward me. "I've just completed my first year at the University of Houston Law Center, with top marks, as you'll see. Now I'm ready to spend the summer as your legal intern." She had an impressive record active in honor societies during her undergraduate studies, high scores on the LSAT, and top 10% in her first-year law class. Then I realized something was off. "Aren't you a little late to be looking for an internship? And with grades like these, shouldn't you be interviewing with one of the big law firms downtown?" Her happy smile faded for a moment. "You're right, of course. To be honest, I had an internship all lined up with Baker, Norton, and Vinson, but just last week they emailed me to say there'd been a mix-up and they didn't have a place for me. I'll bet one of the partners met her and had second thoughts." I shook my head sympathetically. "I know a bit about that firm. I guess you could say they're a little one-dimensional." Her big smile came back again. "Well, their loss is your gain. Besides, I'd much rather get experience in the real world, not spend my summer fetching drinks and doing paperwork. I want to work with real people with everyday problems, the kind you probably deal with all the time." I couldn't help but admire her spirit, but I knew I had no choice. "I'm sorry, MS Armstrong, but I can't take you on either." I saw a moment of anger flash in her eyes, so I hurried on. No, it's not what you're thinking. Listen, I'd love to have someone with your qualifications and your attitude helping me here. But look around you, it's pretty obvious that I'm barely keeping my head above water. There's no way I could pay you even an intern's salary." "I'm sorry." She got a determined look on her face. "You can't take advantage of me if I know what you're offering in advance and agree to it. Besides," and now her eyes were pleading, "I really need the experience and the qualifications." "And Dr. Goldstein said you were a good guy, someone I could learn from." I remembered Goldstein. I'd taken his torts class, and he'd been tough on me. I was surprised he would even remember, much less recommend me. I hope I'm not going to regret this. I stood up and stuck my hand out to her. "All right, MS Armstrong, you're my new summer intern." She gave a little squeal and jumped up to shake my hand. "Thank you, Squire. You won't regret it." I cocked my head when she called me Squire, then laughed as I figured it out. "You must have been misread my sign outside. My name's Wilson, Robert Wilson. Esquire is just an old-fashioned term for lawyer." Oh, I know that she laughed. "When I was growing up, my father was an attorney in our little town, and everybody called him Squire. I guess it just stuck with me." "Well, it's Robert, or Mr. Wilson if we have a client visiting." Now I walked her out of my office. "You can set up over there, but I'm afraid I don't have a desk or chair for you." She looked around, unfazed. "Not a problem. Is it okay if I use your network connection? I've got my laptop in the car." When I nodded, she darted out the door and returned a moment later. Plopping herself in what passed for a reception chair, she began busily working on the computer. As I watched in amusement, she quickly finished whatever she was doing, made a few notes on her cell phone, and then looked up at me. "Is it okay if I don't start for another hour?" I grinned at her. What am I going to do, dock your pay? She laughed and hurried out the door. It was actually an hour and a half before she got back. I heard the sound of a heavy engine outside and went to the door to find out what was going on. She was just hopping down from the cab of a big F-150. Seeing me staring, she waved and beckoned me over. "It's my brother's truck, Squire. He let me borrow it." I started to correct her, but I was so curious that I decided they could wait. She led me around to the bed of the pickup, and when she opened the tailgate, I saw a nice-looking office desk. "Where did you get that?" "Craigslist," she replied. Seeing my face, she hurried on. "Don't worry, it was free. Some company was going out of business and offered their furniture to anyone who'd take it. I also got a desk chair. Can you help me bring them in?" The desk wasn't that big, but I was still impressed at how easily Maddie handled her end of the load. Definitely some kind of athlete, I decided. While she went to return the pickup to her brother, I walked back inside and stood there, bemused at what had just happened. "Definitely not the way I was expecting my morning to go," I said to the new office furniture. 45 minutes later, she breezed into the office. "I'm back, Squire. Now we can get started." And before I could remember to correct her about my name, Hurricane Maddie brought a breath of fresh air into my life. By the end of the first week, she had completely reorganized my filing system. That was actually a good thing, because in truth, I didn't have any system. With so few clients, I'd taken to laying files down on any empty space. When she realized what I'd been doing, Maddie didn't say anything, but the next day I found a new filing cabinet in my office, with all my clients organized alphabetically. Free on Craigslist, she confirmed to my unasked question. My schedule was next. She soon had the calendar on my computer synchronized with my phone and her computer. If we ever do get a lot of clients, I thought wryly, Maddie will make sure we never miss an appointment. Then she connected the whole thing to my billing system. Organization was not her only talent. She also proved to be a wizard at research, zooming through statutes, uncovering precedents, digging out details that might help our clients' cases. I'd always prided myself on my ability, but she put me to shame. Once she became comfortable with the way we were set up, Maddie focused her attention on our clients and their needs. She wanted to know everything about them, and I was happy to give her their files to read and point her toward the relevant statutes. After she'd understood their concerns, she'd come into my office with questions. She especially wanted to know why I handled their case the way I did. Now I started to feel like I was giving her something of value and education in the way an attorney approaches a case. She quickly learned that practicing law in the real world isn't as simple or straightforward as they teach in school. When we weren't dealing with a client, she would bring her law school texts in and we'd discuss cases. I was impressed by the sheer amount of case law she'd already absorbed, and I think she was impressed by the way I went about analyzing the issues. I enjoyed our sessions, and my days passed much more quickly. I'd told Renee about Maddie early on, and she'd found it amusing. One day she came by my office and I introduced Maddie to her. Renee had a hard time hiding her amusement when she heard Maddie call me Squire. That night at home, Renee wouldn't stop teasing me about my assistant. I told her about Maddie's grades and her LSAT scores, but Renee wasn't impressed. That annoyed me. She'd be an intern at your firm if Baker, Norton hadn't withdrawn their offer, I pointed out. "It's a good thing we did," she chortled. I can just imagine the commotion she'd cause, walking down the hallways with that big mop of hair. Well, I think it looks good on her, and I can tell you that underneath that hair is one clever mind. As far as I'm concerned, Baker, Norton's loss is my good luck. Renee rolled her eyes and changed the subject. As the Houston summer unfolded with steadily rising temperatures and humidity, life at the Wilson household grew steadily colder. Where before Renee had been impatient with me and my efforts to start my own law practice, now she grew distant. When I tried to tell her about some new client or an amusing anecdote about Maddie, she clearly wasn't paying attention. When I would suggest we go out for drinks and dinner, she always had work to do. By the end of July, we saw each other only occasionally. Our romantic life was just a memory. The situation became so stressful that one day when Maddie asked me yet another question about procedure, I snapped at her. Her head jerked back as though I'd slapped her in the face, and she quietly got up and left my office. I sat there for a minute, letting my anger dissipate. Then I went out and took a seat next to her desk. "Can I talk to you for a minute, Maddie?" I asked, trying to get her attention. She didn't look at me. "Of course you can, you're the boss." "Maddie, I apologize. You did nothing wrong asking those questions, actually. I'm glad you're so eager to learn. The truth is, the problem is me. I sighed and my shoulders slumped. I might as well tell you. Renee and I are going through a rough patch, and I guess I took it out on you. I'm sorry. She looked at me with concern. What's going on, Squire? I ended up pouring out my heart to her, telling her the whole story about Renee's disappointment with me and the way our relationship had cooled. Maybe it's my fault. I've been so stubborn about making it as an attorney that I've ignored the obvious. I'm just not good enough to make this work. No, she said sharply. You had a goal and you set out to pursue it. I don't know how it will turn out, but I do know that you're a really good attorney. I've learned so much from you already. I appreciate your support, Maddie, but I'm pretty sure that Renee doesn't share that opinion. She looked at me appraisingly. Sounds like things aren't going very well in the romance department either. I gave her a wry smile. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Things are going to get better, Squire. I'm just sure they will. Then she realized what she'd done and snatched her hand away. I had to smile. Thanks for the pep talk, Maddie. Now, I'd better get back to the Coulson suit. That was the way we left things. I made it a point not to bring my home life to the office again, and Maddie was careful not to touch on anything of a personal nature. Both of us knew what the other was doing. Things went on that way until early August. I was working at my desk late one morning when I heard the front door chime ring. Maddie, who had taken on the role of receptionist in addition to everything else, went to see who was there. A minute later, she was at my office door with an odd look on her face. Squire, you have a visitor. She says it's a personal matter. As I stood up to greet my visitor, Renee's old college roommate walked in my door. Mary Margaret, I haven't seen you in ages. How are you? Are you still in Dallas? Still working in Dallas, but I'm down here for the day. My meeting finished up earlier than I expected, and I thought I'd take a chance and see if you could do lunch. I pretended to look at my schedule. Sure, that would be great. Do you want me to try to get Rain to join us? Actually, I caught up with her the last time I was down here. I thought this time I'd try to do the same with you. Okay, well, in that case, let's do it. I led her out into the reception area. I'd like you to meet Madison Armstrong, who's interning with me this summer. Maddie, I'd like you to meet Mary Margaret Olson, an old friend of Renee's and mine. We're going to go get some lunch. Can you hold down the fort while I'm gone? Of course, Squire, she said, and extended her hand to Mary Margaret. Nice to meet you, Ms. Olson. Then she returned to her desk. As Mary Margaret and I walked out the door, something seemed odd to me. Maddie didn't smile, I realized. At that moment, Mary Margaret grabbed my arm and chuckled. What's with the Squire, Robert? I rolled my eyes. That's just Maddie. It's a long story. Mary Margaret took me to a charming little bistro a bit further away than I'd expected, but the food made the drive worth it. Over lunch and a couple of glasses of soda, we caught up with each other's lives and reminisced about old college chums. The conversation was pleasant, but I couldn't help feeling a little uncomfortable. We'd been friends, but Mary Margaret was much closer to Renee than me. My discomfort level rose when the waiter had removed our plates and Mary Margaret looked carefully into my eyes. So how are you and Renee doing these days? Fine, everything is fine. Why do you ask? She gave a dismissive little wave. Oh, nothing really. It's just that Renee mentioned that getting your firm established was all-consuming, and I gather her own workload has soared as well. I was just concerned about you guys. What has Renee told her about us? It's been a little stressful at times, but we'll get through it. She gave a little smile. You know, when you and Renee first started dating, I was very impressed with you. I thought at the time that she'd done very well for herself, and I still think that's the case. I hope she never forgets that. I sat there silently, unsure how to respond. It felt like something else was going on, but I couldn't grasp quite what it was. We drove back to my office, making pleasant chit-chat. But before I could get out of the car, she reached over and squeezed my hand. I really care a lot about you, Robert. Please stay in touch. And if you'd ever like to talk, you know how to reach me. With that, she leaned over and gave me a quick hug. I waved goodbye and walked into the office, to be confronted by Maddie. Well, how was your lunch? She asked blandly. It was fine. It was nice to have a chance to catch up with each other and talk about college. For 2 hours, I quickly glanced at my watch and was startled. I guess the time got away from me. Maddie looked at me oddly. Watch out for that one. She's got a crush. Don't be silly, Maddie. She's Rainey's best friend. She's not interested in me. I'm just saying, Squire. With that, she went back to her desk, and I did the same. but it took me a while to focus on my work. What an odd conversation. Was she really coming on to me? And if so, why now? How strange. I finally decided to tell Renee about our lunch so she wouldn't think I was hiding anything from her. But she got held up at a meeting at work that night, and by the time she got home I had already given up and gone to bed. In my irritation, I forgot about telling her about my lunch guest. If I'd been irritated before, the following week I became downright pessimistic about the prospects for my marriage. I'd hoped that we might do something together, but Renee wound up working both Saturday and Sunday. On Monday, she called me during the morning to give me even more discouraging news. We've just started negotiations over a major acquisition for a client. I can't tell you who's involved, but I guarantee you'll read about it in the Wall Street Journal when it's done. Anyway, the negotiations are being held at the Alessandra Hotel, and since we'll probably be working around the clock to meet the deadline, the firm has booked a block of rooms for us. The bottom line is I probably won't get home much this week. The way things have been going lately, I probably wouldn't even have noticed, I thought bitterly, but I didn't say that to her. I worked late that night, then went out and treated myself to dinner at a nice restaurant. I was hoping against hope that Renee might be there when I got home at 11, but she wasn't. Nor had she come in by the time I got up the next morning. I might as well take off my wedding ring, I thought angrily as I drove to the office. I'm single in every way except name. Nevertheless, I tried not to let my anger affect the way I acted toward Maddie. Late that afternoon, I heard the front door chime, and a minute later Maddie appeared at my office door. "You've got a new client to see you, Squire," she announced with wide eyes. What's gotten into her? When I stood up to greet my visitor, I understood. Maddie brought in one of the most attractive women I'd ever seen in real life. She had a model's cheekbones accented by long blonde hair that was pulled back behind one ear and flowing over the other side of her face. The blouse and jacket she wore did nothing to hide her well-developed bust, and her pencil skirt was cut short enough to reveal long, shapely legs. As I stood there tongue-tied, the woman stepped forward confidently and shook my hand. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Amber Thompson. I apologize for barging in on you like this, but I'm really pressed for time. In a nutshell, I intend to divorce my husband and I want to retain you as my legal counsel." With that, she reached into the patent leather handbag she was carrying and extracted a check. "Here's $2,000 for my retainer. If that's not sufficient, just let me know and I'll be glad to revise it." No, that's perfectly satisfactory, Mrs. Thompson. Why don't you have a seat so we can discuss the details of your situation?" I managed to say, gesturing toward a chair. She smiled and shook her head. "Again, I must apologize, but I don't have time to do that this afternoon. All I wanted today was to be sure to retain your services. If your schedule permits, I'd like to get together with you at this same time tomorrow to go over my case with you." I pretended to check my calendar, but I knew that whenever this goddess wanted to meet, I would do whatever it took to accommodate her. "Tomorrow afternoon will be perfectly fine," I reassured her. "That's wonderful," she breathed. "I'm looking forward to working with you." Then she turned and walked out of my office. After Amber had gone, Maddie came in to stare at me. So I guess she had to hurry back to Victoria's Secret to finish her photo shoot. "Hun?" Maddie gave a little laugh and went back to her desk, but not before pausing to give me a long stare. I didn't want to admit it to Maddie, but Amber had really gotten to me. I'd met attractive women before, but none of them compared to Amber. That night I went home and had some leftovers for dinner, then settled down in front of the TV. I was channel surfing when I hit one of those romantic movies that often run on some of the cable channels. After watching only a few minutes, I switched off the TV and went to my computer. In no time, I'd opened a free dating site, and a few minutes later I found a profile featuring a blonde who looked a little like Amber. As intrigued as I was, it was a real struggle to resist contacting her. Somewhat embarrassed, I closed my laptop and then went to bed. The next morning I got up and took a shower, then spent extra time grooming myself and selecting my best suit and tie. I suddenly realized I was humming as I drove into work, and I shook my head in self-disgust. "You're acting like a teenager going out on a date. You're a married man and Amber is client. Keep it together, Wilson." The day was busy enough to hold my attention, but as the time neared for our appointment, I found myself frequently checking the clock on my phone. When 3:30 finally rolled around and Amber didn't show, disappointment washed over me. 15 minutes later, I got up to have a look outside, but there was still no Amber. When I came back, Maddie smirked at me but said nothing. Just then my phone rang. And when I answered, I heard Amber's melodic voice. "Robert, it seems like all I ever do is apologize to you. I'm running late here at work. Is there any chance you could meet me somewhere near here?" "Sure, I can do that. Where would you like to meet?" "By any chance, do you like jazz?" "There's a little place I love called the Downbeat where we can have a drink and talk." I was pleasantly surprised. I love jazz, and the Downbeat is my favorite place in Houston. "I can be there in an hour." "That's perfect, I'll see you there then." I was straightening up my desk when Maddie came in. "So you've got a client meeting, Squire?" I frowned at her. "I have a client meeting, not a date." "Were you listening to my conversation?" She folded her arms. "Pretty hard not to when you were talking that loud." "Look, she just got stuck at work and couldn't get away. We're going to meet somewhere near her office and talk about her case." She nodded. Then her face took on an expression I couldn't read. "Just be careful, Squire." "I promise," Maddie, I reassured her as I headed for the door. The Downbeat is located in an avant-garde area of Houston filled with lots of little shops, bars, and eateries. It's almost always busy, but I was lucky enough to pull into the parking area just as someone else was leaving. I walked up the stairs to the club and looked around for Amber. She was standing by a table in the back of the lounge waving to me. When I hurried over, she took my hands and leaned over to give me a friendly hug. A hint of her perfume wafted to me. I didn't recognize it. "I hope you don't mind meeting here. I thought we could talk and listen to the music at the same time." "No, this is great, a much welcome change from my little office." We ordered drinks and I asked her to tell me about her case. She scooted her chair closer to mine and leaned her head toward me so we won't disturb others. Again, I inhaled her perfume. It was delightful but not overpowering. The divorce she was seeking was about as straightforward as they come. We met in high school, dated exclusively through college, and married young. But gradually the two of us grew apart, developing different tastes, opinions, and interests. Irreconcilable differences. That really describes what happened to us. So we decided to do the civilized thing and divorce on friendly terms. We've basically agreed on a property settlement. All I need now is someone in my corner to make sure I haven't overlooked anything and to help me get through the process. If only everyone would take such a mature attitude. "Sure, I can definitely do that." "Thank you," she said. "Now, if we're going to work together, I'd like to know a little about you, as a person." That wasn't a request I normally got from a client, but I didn't mind telling her a little about myself. We began to exchange bits of our histories, some of the who, what, when, where, and why of our lives. As we did so, the waitress brought another round and some snacks, and two delightful things happened. First, Amber proved to be a good listener, drawing me out, showing real interest in what I was sharing. Second, when she began talking about herself, I discovered to my surprise how much we had in common. We liked the same music, had gone to many of the same concerts, enjoyed the same movies, preferred the same cuisines. It was almost uncanny. As we started on another round of drinks, I found myself thinking it's like we were made for each other. We talked long enough that another round had appeared and been emptied. While the band was taking a break, Amber leaned close and said, "I need to use the restroom. Please wait, I'll be right back." Back at our table, another round was waiting. Before I could say anything, she smiled and said, "After this one, I'll need to be going." I really didn't want the evening to end, so I settled down beside her and picked up the glass, intending to nurse my drink as long as I could. The band had returned, and as we sipped our drinks, she leaned over and said fervently, "I just love this number." Indeed, the little trio was improvising on a classic Miles Davis composition, one of my favorites as well. I smiled my appreciation, and we sat there almost touching, enjoying the music. After a minute or two, she laid her head on my shoulder, and her perfume came to me again. The moment seemed magical, and I suddenly realized I was getting butterflies in my stomach. There was no guilt this time, just a feeling of genuine happiness. As we finished our drinks, we turned to look intently into each other's eyes. A round of applause from the other patrons startled me, and I stood up instinctively as the house lights came on. Then Amber whispered, "I took an Uber over here. Could you possibly give me a ride home?" Of course, I replied without hesitation, "I'd love to." "Lead the way," she said, so I took her hand and led her out to the parking area and my car. When I pulled out onto the street, she leaned over to take my arm as she gave me directions to her apartment. When I parked at the curb in front of her building, she gave me a meaningful look and breathed, "If you'll come up with me, I can give you a copy of that proposed property settlement." All I could do was nod. We held hands once again as we walked into the lobby, and she didn't let me go as we rode up on the elevator. Once inside her apartment, she led me over to a seating area. Her cell phone chimed softly, and she glanced at the text, replied quickly, and then smiled at me. When she disappeared down the hallway, I glanced around at her apartment. Everything was perfectly in place. It looks like a furniture showroom. Suddenly, a sound from the wooden coffee table startled me, and I realized her cell phone was vibrating with another text. I picked it up to put it on something quieter, and was surprised when the screen lit up. It displayed a conversation Amber had apparently been having with someone the whole evening. Is he there yet? Just arrived X and drink? Done, don't forget vid. Okay, my foggy brain had difficulty interpreting the cryptic messages, but then I noticed something that set off an alarm I couldn't ignore. There was no name attached to the texts, just a phone number I knew by heart: Renee's. Why is Renee texting Amber? What is happening? I couldn't piece it together, but I suddenly felt a strong urge to leave. I quickly tore a page off an architectural digest lying on the coffee table and scribbled a note in the margin: sorry, have to leave. Just got an emergency call from my office. Call me tomorrow. Robert. With that, I rushed to the door and let myself out as quietly as possible. Once back in my car, I drove away as fast as I safely could. What was all that about? How does Renee know Amber? How did she know we were meeting tonight? What did those texts mean? Between my alcohol-induced haze and my panic, I paid no attention where I was driving, so I was surprised to find I'd gone to my office. Not knowing what else to do, I stumbled to the door and let myself inside. I sat down on the Craigslist sofa Maddie had found for us and put my head in my hands, trying to stop the room from spinning. Finally, I gave up and lay down to rest my eyes. Squire, wake up. Are you all right? What happened? I groggily opened my eyes to see Maddie's worried face hovering over me. Oh gosh, I mumbled, clumsily sitting up. What time is it? It's a little after 7. Oh shoot. Then I looked up at her. Do you happen to have some aspirin? She rushed to her purse and came back with 2 tablets in a coffee mug. I swallowed the aspirin and took a big sip of coffee and yelped. Ow, that's hot. Good, she said with her hands on her hips. Maybe that will help you sober up. I shook my head, which made it hurt worse. I had a lot to drink last night, but I don't think that's all of it. She dragged her desk chair over in front of me and sat down with a concerned look on her face. What happened, Squire? Walk me through it, and we'll try to figure it out. I began to describe the night's events, leaving out certain details. Nevertheless, it must have been obvious to Maddie because she sarcastically asked, "Is that how you usually conduct client meetings?" I didn't bother to reply. She knew the answer. When I got to the part about taking Amber up to her apartment, Maddie's expression changed to something I couldn't quite identify. So did you sleep over? She demanded. No, that's when it got really strange. I thought we'd already gone way past strange. I ignored her. While Amber was back in her bedroom, her cell phone began to vibrate with a text. I glanced at it, and it blew my mind. The text was from Renee. Maddie's eyes went wide. Renee? Like your wife Ren? Exactly. I recognized Renee's cell number. That freaked me out. How does Renee Amber, and why would she be texting her at that hour? What did the text say exactly? There was a whole series of messages, and I can't remember them all. But she was asking Amber about X and video. Anyway, I got totally paranoid, wrote Amber a note about a break-in at the office, and left. Maddie stared at me in shock. Wow, this is definitely more than we bargained for. We need to figure out what's going on. Let's start by trying to contact Amber and see if she can shed some light on this situation. That's about the first clever thing you did all night. Maddie does sarcasm well. I ignored her again. When I got to my car, I was having trouble thinking. Maybe it was all those drinks, but it seemed like something more. Anyway, I ended up here and fell asleep on the couch. And I still don't understand what happened. Maddie was silent for a moment, then she leaned forward. Squire, I think you were set up. My head was still pounding. What do you mean set up? Did you suggest going to the jazz club to meet? No, that was Amber's idea. And were you the one who gave her cocktails? Well, no, but I didn't object. I see. And did you offer to take her home? Well, she asked, but I was glad to do it. Besides, she said she had a copy of her husband's proposed agreement back at her apartment. Right. So basically you're telling me she decided where you'd go, how long you'd stay, how much you'd drink, when you'd leave, and that you'd end up back at her apartment. Oh, goodness, I mumbled, holding my forehead. And those texts you saw, did Renee ask Amber where you were? No, I don't think so. All she asked was, is he there yet? What was the last text you saw? Don't forget the recording. So what do you think was taking Amber so long back in the bedroom? She said she wanted to freshen up, but I was hoping she was changing into something more comfortable. Maddie rolled her eyes. Listen, Squire, if a woman is that interested in you, it doesn't take very long to change into her pajamas. I'll bet she was making sure a hidden camera was all set to record what was going to happen next. My head was feeling better by now, but my mood was growing worse. Shoot, 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 shoot. I'll bet you're right. Suddenly, it dawned on me. And I bet I know why Renee was going to use Amber's little video shoot to blackmail me. Now it was Maddie's turn to be confused. But why would Renee want to blackmail you, Squire? I thought she was the one who had all the money. Exactly, I said, the pieces coming together quickly now. She wants to divorce me on the grounds of cheating so she can get out of having to split her assets with me. I shook my head in disgust. I knew things were bad between us, but I never thought she'd try something as shady as this. But who is Amber, and how does she fit into all this? Isn't it obvious she's the bait to lure me into the trap? She's probably some high-priced escort Renee hired. Then I paused. But if she is, she sure fooled me. She knew so much about me, and we had so much in common. Just then, my phone rang, and I recognized the number. It's Amber, I mouthed to Maddie. Get her over here. If we can talk to her, maybe we can get to the bottom of all this. It amused me that Maddie wanted to play detective, but I wanted to know what was going on too, so I answered. Hi, Maddie, sorry about disappearing on you last night. I thought there'd been a break-in at my office, but it turned out someone accidentally set off the alarm. Listen, I was going to call you. Is there any way you can bring that property settlement over here this morning? And then, I let my tone of voice deepen. If you're not busy after work, maybe we could get together and continue the lovely evening we were having. Maddie made a face at me, but Amber sounded willing and even a little relieved. She promised to swing by my office before noon. You're not thinking of going out with her again, are you? Maddie demanded after I'd hung up the phone. I grinned at her. No, even I'm not that foolish. But if she's still trying to trap me, I wanted to give her some encouragement that she could make that happen. Maddie nodded, and I noted the little smile that flitted across her lips. Then she was all business. Listen, while we're waiting for her to show up, why don't we do a little research on Amber Thomas to see what we can find out? We sat down side by side at Maddie's computer. First things first, I said, let's check the court records to see if Amber Thomas has filed for divorce. No surprise, there was nothing. With nothing else to go on, Maddie did a quick Google search on Amber Thomas, Houston, TX. We got just over 40 hits, with occupations ranging from teacher to technician to homemaker and more. This is going to take a while, I muttered. Then I had an idea. Let's check the police records and see if we can find anything. If she's really a prostitute, maybe she's been picked up for soliciting. It seemed like a good idea, but we found nothing to help us. Maddie shook her head. Amber Thomas is probably a fake name anyway. Then suddenly she perked up. What was the address of her apartment? Maybe we can find out something that way. When I gave her the address, she quickly went to the tax records. It took a while, but then she was looking at me with concern. Squire, if I'm doing this right, the apartment where you took her was purchased by Baker, Norton, and Vincent 5 years ago. Now that is interesting. Let me try something else. Just to be sure, she said, and did a quick search on the law firm. Once she got to their website, she found a list of employees. There were well over 100 names, but they were in alphabetical order. Again, a Miss No Amber Thomas. Maddie slumped in her chair and was about to close the window when she suddenly paused. Wait a minute, look at this. Her cursor highlighted an Amber Tompkins in accounting. When she clicked on the name, up popped a headshot of Amber Thomas. Darn, Squire, she works for your wife's firm. I shook my head in confusion. They may work at the same law firm, Maddie, but Amber is in a different department. She wouldn't have anything to do with Renee. Well, at least we know where Renee recruited her. Maybe we can fill in the gaps when Amber gets here. We tried to get a little work done, but it was hard to focus. At 11, we heard a car pull up outside. Then Amber walked into my office, looking as beautiful as I remembered her. Before she could say anything, however, Maddie entered behind Amber, and I gestured. I don't think you've met my legal assistant, Madison Armstrong. Amber was momentarily taken aback, but then extended her hand with a big smile. Nice to meet you, MS. Armstrong, I'm Amber Thomas. "And nice to meet you too, Amber Tompkins," Maddie said without a corresponding smile. Amber turned pale and gave a little gasp. Then she caught herself. "I think you misheard me, it's Amber Thomas." Maddie glared at her. "I meant exactly what I said, Amber Tompkins." Amber looked around nervously to me for help, only to find me standing with my arms folded and a stern look on my face. "We know who you are, Amber. Now I think it's time you tell us what's going on." Amber looked from me to Maddie and back again with a stricken expression. Then, to our surprise, she burst into tears and slumped down in a chair. "I never wanted to do this. I told Renee it was a foolish idea, but she wouldn't listen." She cried a little more, then retrieved a handkerchief from her purse and dried her eyes. "All right, I'll tell you the whole story. Renee set up the whole thing. She intercepted you at home so you'd be more open to me. She coached me on what to say to you, your preferences and dislikes, anything to make you more comfortable with me. And just in case that wasn't enough, she gave me something to put in your drink. When I went to the restroom, I said bitterly, 'That's correct.' Then I convinced you to take me back to the firm's guest apartment." I looked at Maddie. "That explains why it looked so sterile and unlived in." I stared at Amber. "There wasn't a single personal item anywhere in the room." She nodded unhappily. "And when you went back to the bedroom, what were you doing?" "I was changing into a nightgown." She blushed. "Renee told me what kind of lingerie you like." "I'll bet that wasn't all you were doing," Maddie interrupted. Now Amber couldn't look at us, and I turned on the hidden camera Renee gave me and made sure it was focused on the bed. Maddie snorted angrily, but I had other questions. "Why, Amber? Why did you and Renee try to set me up like that?" Now she looked at me with pleading eyes. "She wouldn't talk about that, but I think the answer is pretty obvious. She wants out of your marriage so she can be with Hoffmeister. Lots of people know they're having a relationship. Vance Hoffmeister, he's her boss. The firm would never approve of them dating." She shook her head. "The top management doesn't know. And once they're both divorced, the firm can't say anything. All they'll do is assign her to a new boss." I turned to Maddie. "We were right, it was a preemptive strike. Get undeniable proof of my unfaithfulness, then get a quick, pain-free divorce with little or no settlement for me. The word is that Renee is up for partner soon," Amber added. "If she gets it, she'll start taking home the really big bucks. She probably doesn't want you to get a piece of that." I stared at her. "But why you, Amber? How did you get mixed up in this sordid little scheme? I can't see what you have to gain." She began to cry again, softly but bitterly. "It's my own stupid fault. When my marriage broke up a couple of years ago, I ran up some big debts. I was gradually paying them down when my sister got ill and needed money for an operation. She had no assets, and I had no credit. She wouldn't look at us. But I did have access to an escrow account I'd set up for one of the firm's clients. I was desperate, so I transferred $48,000 to help my sister. I know it was wrong, but what else could I do?" Now she looked at me defiantly. "Nobody noticed anything, and I started gradually repaying the money. I had just finished paying everything back when Renee came to me. She knew all about what I'd done, and she demanded my help in exchange for her silence. Her defiance evaporated. What she wanted help with was you." I glanced at Maddie. The anger in her face was gone, replaced by compassion. I couldn't help feeling a little sorry for the woman as well. "So what do we do now, Squire?" "I don't know, Maddie. I wish there was some way to turn the tables on Renee and her boss, but I have no idea how to do that." Suddenly, Amber brightened. "I think I know a way." We both stared at her in surprise. "You know how they've been in negotiations all this week at the Alessandra? Well, I know which room we booked for Renee, and the gossip is the two of them are practically living together. If we could sneak that webcam into her room, maybe you could get exactly what you need." I brightened momentarily, then reality set in. "That would be great," I said, "but we don't have James Bond working for us. How in the world could one of us sneak into a luxury hotel, break into a locked room, set up a camera, and get out unseen?" Maddie stared at me. "I can do it." "How?" I asked dubiously. "Dress up like a maid. They've got access to all the rooms. And just how do you plan on doing that?" She gave a little smile. "My mom is a maid at the Alessandra." I stared at her. I hadn't known. Then the image of Maddie dressed as a maid came to me, and I instinctively recoiled. "No, Maddie, you can't do that. You're a law student. It wouldn't look." I tailed off, not knowing what to say. Besides, it would be too risky. What if Renee walked in on you? Amber piped up, I'm supposed to be over there with the team this afternoon to give them support. I could call you to let you know when the meeting breaks up. Maddie folded her arms and a look of determination came across her face. Then it settled. She stared at me. I've got this, Squire. The three of us spent a little longer working out the details of our plan, then set out to put it in motion. Maddie went outside to call her mother. After a long conversation that I would have loved to eavesdrop on, she came back and nodded. She's going to help me. We're all set. The three of us got in my car and drove to the BNV-owned apartment that Amber had been using. She went inside and soon came back with a camera that looked remarkably tiny to me. Are you sure that will work? I asked dubiously. You'd be surprised how well she replied. And we can connect to it over the internet? Sure, using the hotel's Wi-Fi. From there we drove downtown to Dallas Street and pulled into the garage next door to the Alessandra. I hope we can get internet service on my laptop, I thought as I drove up to the roof. As it turned out, I needn't have worried. The hotel Wi-Fi signal was strong enough that it bled outside the building. We were easily able to link in using the password Amber gave us. Then I entered the URL for the webcam, and we were ready. While I was getting set up, Amber hurried away to make her appearance with the BNV support staff, and Maddie left to meet up with her mother. I was left to sit in the hot car with my cell phone at the ready, worrying about all the things that could go wrong with our harebrained scheme. When my phone rang an hour later, it startled me out of my heat-induced daze. Robert, it's Amber. The meeting is about to break up. Is the webcam in place? I haven't heard from Maddie. I'll call her right away. I hung up and speed-dialed Maddie. The maid service just got to Renee's floor, she told me. I'm going to slip into her room now. Hurry, I urged. They're probably on their way there now. The phone went dead, and I spent the next few minutes anxiously alternating between checking my phone and my laptop. My phone chirped first a text from Maddie. Almost done, it read. I refreshed my laptop's connection to the web address Amber had given us, and suddenly I saw Maddie's face staring at me. I almost didn't recognize her. She had on a shapeless gray dress and wore her hair pulled back and covered by a large gray handkerchief. Maddie, hurry. I hissed, and she almost fell over backward. You scared me, she accused, then went back to tinkering with the position of the camera. At that moment, I heard the sound of a car key opening the door lock, and my wife walked into the room. Oh my God, she's met Maddie before. She's sure to recognize her. As I held my breath, Renee glanced at Maddie and then looked around. What are you doing here? She demanded. Maddie actually curtsied. Turn down service, ma, I am. She calmly walked over to the king-size bed and pulled down the bed covers from one of the pillows. Would you like one mint or two? She asked brightly. No mints, Renee snapped, turning away from her. Just finish up and get out. Yes, ma, I am. Sorry to disturb you, ma, I am. With that, Maddie turned, winked at the camera, and then coolly walked out of the room. Fortunately, I remembered to mute the speaker on my laptop because I let out a huge sigh of relief. She didn't recognize Maddie. I guess Renee couldn't be bothered to pay attention to the help. At that moment, the passenger door jerked open, startling me half to death until I saw Amber slide into the car. Did Maddie make it in time? She asked. I gestured to the laptop and touched the screen. Renee's room reappeared, but it was vacant. Then I noticed that the door to the bathroom was closed. I'll bet Renee's in there, I said. We heard a jaunty knock at the hotel room door, and Renee hurried out of the bathroom wearing the complimentary robe the Alessandra provided. When she opened the door, a man strode into the room. That's Hofmeister, Amber whispered. Thank goodness you're finally here, Renee said fervently. I thought those old dinosaurs would never get finished. Vance grabbed her by the shoulders and hugged her. You think you had it bad. I had to sit across the table from you that whole session, thinking about what I was going to do to you when the meeting finally ended. I knew what was going to happen, but that still didn't prepare me for the reality. Renee, the woman I'd loved unconditionally for most of our marriage, was about to give herself to another man before my eyes. I must have made a little sound because Amber reached across the console and patted my arm. I'm sorry, she whispered. Suddenly, the back door of my car flew open, startling the two of us. Maddie clambered in, still dressed in her maid's outfit. I got here as quick as I could, she said breathlessly. Did I miss anything? I gestured wordlessly at the laptop, and she leaned over the seat back to get a good look. Oh, she said, and fell silent. I reached over and switched off the web feed. I think we've got all we need. and I know that's about all I can take." My companions looked at me with sympathetic eyes, and we all sat silently for a few moments. Then Maddie reached up to squeeze my shoulder again. "Squire, I have to get moving. I've got to get the maid's key and this uniform back to my mom, and she wants me to stay and have dinner with her tonight. She says I've been ignoring her." "Of course, Maddie, I understand. Listen, I can't thank you enough for what you did today. You took a huge risk, and I should never have let you do it. But if you hadn't, we wouldn't have the video. You know I'd do anything, Squire." She seemed to get a little choked up. "Anyway, I've got to run." With that, she climbed out of the back seat and hurried to the parking garage's elevator. I turned to Amber. "And the same goes for you. If you hadn't helped us, I'd still be in the dark about Renee's plans." She smiled ruefully and gave my hand a pat. "After what I tried to do to you, it was the least I could do." "Yeah, but that was because you were being blackmailed." "Maybe so, but either way you gave me a chance to make things right." "I'm very grateful for that." Then she sat up a little straighter. "So what happens next?" "I've been thinking about that. I want to edit this video and make a copy. Once I've done that, I've got to figure out a way to get Baker to watch it." Her smile was just as charming as the first time. "I think I can help you with that too. There's going to be a banquet tonight at the hotel to celebrate the completion of negotiations. Renee and Vance will be there, of course, and they think I'll be, in finalizing the deal with you. Then there'll be a morning session here tomorrow to wrap up loose ends, and Baker is going to attend." She gave a little smile. "He always has to be the last one to speak. Anyway, you could catch him then before he goes back to the office." "That's perfect." I told her. "I want to take advantage of the situation. I'll have to work late, but it will be worth it." She pouted prettily and looked at me from lowered eyelids. "That's too bad, Robert. You're really quite an impressive guy. I was sort of hoping to spend some time with you without any cameras around." Now I was the one to blush. "I can't tell you how tempting that is, Amber, but I'm going to have to decline for at least one more night. I really have to have everything lined up for tomorrow." She gave me an endearing pout. "My loss. Anyway, I'll give you a call tomorrow so you'll know when to come back to the hotel." Then she turned to get out of the car. "Amber," I interrupted her, "I really am grateful for everything you've done for me. I want you to know I'm going to take care of you, okay?" She gave me another one of her bright smiles. "I'd really like to take care of you too, Robert." I can't believe you turned that down. I cursed myself as I watched her walk to the elevator. After she was gone, I drove to a little restaurant I liked and picked up some food, then headed to my office. Another night of eating at my desk while working. My first task was to edit the video we just made. Nothing drastic, just enough to focus on the crucial parts, so to speak. It took a while, but when I was satisfied, I made a copy I could give to Baker. After that, I pulled out my law books and did a little review on contracts. I'd given a lot of thought to what I wanted out of the mess of my marriage, and the last thing I needed was to mess anything up with a legal error. I worked on the contract for several hours. When it was done, I printed off several copies and put them in a legal-size envelope. Then I got up and went out to our outdated office sofa to put my feet up and rest. Now that I'd finished everything I needed to do that evening, I took a little time to think about my situation. While I was editing that video, I couldn't help thinking about Renee and our marriage. I had loved her so much, and I thought she loved me just as much. Why had all that changed? Looking back, it was clear that I became a disappointment to her. She'd wanted a spouse with a fancy title who made lots of money. I guess I'd wanted that too, but when things hadn't worked out at Allied, I'd still wanted to practice law. I glanced around my shabby little office. Even if it wasn't glamorous or particularly high-paying, it was mine, and I was doing what I wanted to do. Why couldn't Renee be happy for me? But even if I'd disappointed her, even if she wanted out of our marriage, that was no justification for her trying to mess with me over so badly. It hurt that she'd found another partner at Byrne to learn she'd deceived me for so long. But she wasn't content to divorce me and leave. She had to try to set things up so I'd lose everything. Her infidelity was bad enough. Her betrayal was unforgivable. And because of her betrayal, my life was about to change dramatically. Whether or not I managed to pull off my little plan tomorrow, my life could never go back to the way it was. I'd be burning my bridges for practicing law. Heck, I'd be burning my bridges for working in Houston. Thanks a lot, Renee. I lay back, closed my eyes, and tried not to think about what was happening to my life. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Maddie was shaking me awake. Squire, is everything okay? Hi, Maddie, yes, everything's fine. I just worked late on our plan, and I guess I fell asleep. I sat up and looked at her curiously. What are you doing here anyway? It's Saturday, you're not supposed to be at work. Her face fell, and for a moment I thought she was going to cry. I know, Squire. I just wanted to come say goodbye to you in person. I jumped to my feet. Goodbye? What are you talking about? I have to go back to school. Monday is the first day of classes. No, that can't be right. She shook her head sorrowfully. I'm afraid it is. But you can't go, Maddie. What will I do without you here? Now tears began to trickle down her cheeks. I stood up, stunned at the thought of her leaving. In the back of my mind, I'd known she'd go back to school, of course. But so much had happened, and we'd made such a good team that I'd completely forgotten. Maddie, I don't know what to say. I'll write you the best recommendation any intern ever got, if it will help. I'd do anything for you. I just wish you didn't have to go. She hugged me tightly. I'll never forget you, Squire. She gave me a friendly hug, then turned and darted for the door. I could hear her sniffling, and to be honest, I felt like crying as well. At that moment, my cell phone rang, and I checked the display to see it was Amber. I hope you're ready, she said in a hushed voice as though others were near. The meeting's going to break up in the next half hour, so you'd better get here ASAP. Thanks, Amber, I said grimly. I'll be right there. When I arrived on the 21st floor, Amber rushed up to greet me, panting for breath. You just made it. She pointed at the double doors behind her. He should be coming out of there any minute. Thanks, Amber. Now, you need to make yourself scarce. Good luck, she whispered, and gave me a friendly hug before dashing away. I looked back and saw the conference room doors open, revealing Roger Baker walking through with several aides. This is it. I walked up and blocked his path. Hello, Mr. Baker. He looked up, surprised, and his aides shuffled about uncertainly. Then his face lit up in recognition. I know you. You're Renee Wilson's husband, aren't you? I nodded. You have a good memory. He smirked. What can I do for you, young man? Actually, I just wanted to give you fair warning that on Monday I'm going to file a lawsuit against your firm that will damage its reputation for years to come. There was a collective gasp from the younger people around him, but Baker's face simply twisted into a sneer. Really, Mr. Wilson? On what grounds can you possibly be suing us? Let's start with a planned scheme to defraud, legal malpractice, misuse of client funds, misappropriation, extortion, blackmail, violation of the Texas Bar Association's Code of Conduct, should I continue. Over the murmurs from his staff, Baker waved his hand dismissively. Talk is cheap, young man. If you want to make a fool of yourself, we'll see you in court. I'm losing him. Don't you want to see the evidence I have? I held up the flash drive with a copy of our video. Do you know what this is? His vanity got the best of him. I'm not as computer illiterate as you think. I know what a flash drive is. Then if one of your people has a laptop with them, you can see what I have and make your own judgment. He motioned to an aide, who handed him a laptop. He held his hand out to me for the drive. Well? I glanced at his entourage. With all due respect to your colleagues, I think you'll want to view this in private. He stared at me coldly, then made up his mind. Find me an empty room, he ordered to anyone nearby, and the group scurried away. A moment later, they held open a door and motioned for Baker to enter. The white-haired attorney walked away with authority, and I hurried to follow. If this is some kind of joke, sir, you'll regret it, but I had already inserted the drive and clicked on the icon. As the image filled the screen and began to play, his threat was halted by the sight of my wife on the hotel bed. I let the video play. Then I reached over and paused it. I think you've recognized my wife, Renee Wilson, although I hope you haven't seen her like that before. He said nothing, but he didn't take his eyes off the screen. The man, of course, is one of your junior partners, Vance Hoffmeister. As you can see, he and my wife are very close. Still nothing from Baker. I do want to point out a few things about Mr. Hoffmeister. The first is that he is Renee's supervisor at your firm, which goes against B&V's Code of Conduct. The second is that, if my research is correct, Mr. Hoffmeister is also your niece's husband. Baker couldn't hide his disgust. That cheating jerk. Mr. Baker, unless you prefer otherwise, I'll spare you the next half hour of events on this video. If you have any doubts, however, I can assure you they're included in all their explicit detail. He shook his head. I know. Then let's move on to the excuse the language real point of interest that you need to see. Before I do, I must mention that your two attorneys are engaging in inappropriate behavior in a room your firm booked in this very hotel. I reached over to restart the video, and the scene jumped ahead to the two lovers lying satisfied on the bed. As we watched and listened, they began their discussion of the scheme to deceive me into doing something wrong. I saw Baker scowl, then he suddenly looked up at me. What was that part about misappropriation? I stopped the playback. I regret to inform you that Amber Tompkins, a member of your administrative staff, managed to take nearly $50,000 from an escrow account your firm manages. These two found out about it and blackmailed her into trying to seduce me. Watching Baker's face, I couldn't tell if he was more disgusted by the blackmail or the theft. I reached over to the keyboard again. There's just one more segment that I think you'll want to see. On the screen, my wife was looking at her lover. What about you? How soon can you leave your current partner? We've talked about that, Renee. I can't do anything until Baker is gone. But I have it on good authority that he's going to retire after Christmas. I just have to wait until the new year, then I can file too. The timing will be perfect, babe. By then your marriage will be over, and once I've filed, we'll be free to see each other openly. We'll have a whirlwind romance and be married in no time, you'll see. All right, she sighed, but it's so hard waiting. A mischievous smile appeared on her face. I stopped the video. Those are quite the pair of employees you have, sir. And what I find particularly interesting about that last segment is that I understand your niece is expecting a baby. It appears that your sister's grandchild will grow up without her father present in their life. As he stared at the screen, he was visibly angry. After a minute or two, he regained his composure and turned to me. You know this video isn't allowed as evidence in court. I smiled at him. That will be up to a judge to decide, won't it? But he will see it, and others will see it, and the word will spread just the same. In this digital age, privacy is a thing of the past. You know it's only a matter of time before this gets on the internet. I put on a show of fake sympathy. Imagine what it will do to your firm's reputation to have its attorneys conspiring to blackmail. Consider how your clients will feel, knowing that someone in administration can steal from their accounts at will. And think about how your niece will feel, especially in the crucial final stage of her pregnancy. He leaned against a desk and folded his arms. How much do you want? Sir, how much do you want to make all of this go away? I opened the envelope I'd brought, pulled out 2 copies of the contract I'd prepared, and handed them to him. I think you'll find this covers it. He shook his head sourly and began reading. $5 million. If you'll keep reading, you'll see that it's $5 million net of taxes. That's outrageous. I don't think so at all. Clearly, after all this is over, I'm not going to be able to practice law in Houston anymore. You're simply covering the present value of the potential earnings I'll have to forego. Besides, from what I hear, that amount is not far from what a senior partner at your firm makes in a year. He humped, but went on reading. A minute later, he looked up with a puzzled expression. You don't want your money for 3 months? I want to make dang sure it's not part of any divorce settlement. He said nothing, but I thought I saw a smile flit across his face. The next paragraph caught his attention. Amnesty for Tompkins? Why do you want to protect her? She only took those funds because her sister needed an operation. Moreover, she completely replaced them before Renee and Vance discovered her embezzlement. I think she deserves a little compassion. He sighed, shook his head, and continued reading. Finally, he looked up at me again. You know I can't sign anything now. I'll need to have another attorney look this over. I laughed in his face. The best-known attorney in Houston, the head of Baker, Norton and Vinson, can't review a simple contract? Listen, you can either sign now or I take that video to the offices of the Houston Chronicle. That's bribery, young man. No, sir. That's negotiations. He glowered at me for a moment, then reached for his pen. If you breach this non-disclosure agreement, there'll be heck to pay, he snapped. Keeping quiet about all this is in my best interest too, sir. He shook his head in disgust, then signed and dated both copies. When he was done, he handed me my copy. To my surprise, he gave me a nod. You know, I'd have done the same thing if I were in your shoes. Wow, I didn't expect that. Then a sly look came over his face. I believe it's time for me to have a little chat with Renee and Vance. Want to stick around and watch? I believe you've earned it. I would like that very much, I said in a determined voice. He went to the door and yanked it open, startling the people hovering around outside. I want to see Hofmeister and Wilson in here now." The little crowd scattered again. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and then Renee and Vance let themselves in. "You wanted to see us, Mr. Baker?" Renee asked. Then she spotted me. "Robert, what are you doing here?" Baker interrupted. "Ms. Wilson, I've been watching you during the negotiations this week, and I must say you've done some good work for us." She beamed at the compliment. "Well, thank you, sir, But he hadn't finished. "So you can appreciate my disappointment in having to discharge you for cause." "What?" She gasped. "Why?" Baker gestured at me. "Your husband here has been telling me some interesting things about your marriage." I could see her thinking on her feet. "Sir, anything he's told you is a lie. Robert and I are in the process of getting a divorce. He'd say anything to put me in a bad light." Baker smiled slyly. "It's not his words I'm relying on, Ms. Wilson, it's your own." With that, he swiveled the laptop around and clicked the icon. When the image of the two lovers began to play, both Renee and Vance gasped. "How in the heck?" Vance cursed, while Renee reached out to shut the laptop. But Baker's gesture stopped her. "Let's just watch and listen a little longer, shall we?" As the guilty pair watched in horror, Baker allowed my edited version to play out in its entirety, including their discussion of their extortion scheme. When her screen image reached down for Hofmeister's hand, Baker slapped the laptop closed. "I said you were a good attorney, Ms. Wilson. Would you like to tell me how many laws, regulations, codes, and ethical standards you confessed to violating on that video?" "But Mr. Baker." "That's enough," he snapped. Then he stalked over and opened the door. "Mr. Rosen," he called, gesturing at one of his aides. "Accompany Ms. Wilson back to the office and remain with her while she empties her desk. She is allowed to remove only personal items, no files, no electronic equipment, no papers. Inspect everything, then escort her out of the building. Do you understand?" The man quivered. "Yes, sir." Renee had time for one shocked glance over her shoulder at Vance before she disappeared from sight. During this whole time, Hofmeister had backed into a corner of the room, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. It wasn't sufficient. Baker turned his attention to the cowering man. "Under any other circumstances, Hofmeister, you'd be out the door with your lover. But I love my sister and her daughter, and I'm not going to dismiss the father of her unborn child, no matter how awful you are. I will, however, remove you as a partner, effective immediately. Instead, I'm making you my personal assistant on special assignment. I'm going to send you somewhere where you'll be less likely to be tempted by the next unpleasant person who walks across your field of vision. Now, get out of my sight and go home to your spouse. And Vance, treat her like a queen, understood?" "Yes, sir," he squeaked and scurried from the room. Baker slumped down in the chair and turned to me. "Well, Mr. Wilson, are you satisfied?" "Yes, sir, I am," I told him. "Good. Then get the heck out of here. I need to call my partners and unretire. It's obvious that this place has gone to the dogs and I need to clean up the mess." He cocked his head and looked at me appraisingly. "You know, I may have hired the wrong Wilson." Then his face hardened and he stared balefully at me. "That said, I would still prefer never to see your face again." I grinned and started for the door. "Likewise, I'm sure." Then I left with my copy of the contract clutched tightly in my hand. 2 days later, the Monday after the big confrontation at the Alessandra, I filed for divorce on the grounds of unfaithfulness. Baker surprised me by arranging for me to get a quick hearing before a sympathetic judge. I guess he didn't want things to drag out and risk anything becoming public. Renee didn't contest the divorce. She'd seen the video I'd taken of Vance and she didn't want that shown in court. Of course, I was bound by the non-disclosure agreement not to do that, but she didn't know about my deal with Baker. I didn't enlighten her. Early on after I'd filed, she did call me to ask if there was any way I could forgive her. "Even if I could forget your unfaithfulness, I could never forgive your betrayal," I told her. She didn't try to argue any further. It probably helped that I offered her a straightforward property settlement: "You take yours, I'll take mine. Anything jointly owned, we split." I could have tried to punish her, but I didn't want her to fight me and discover I couldn't use the video against her. She opted to take my deal and cut her losses. Good riddance. We put our house on the market and priced it to sell quickly. It did, and although we didn't make any money on the sale, at least it was off our hands. One more task completed, one more link between us severed. While I was waiting for the divorce to become final, I spent my time winding up my legal practice. Some of my clients I could handle in the time I had left. The others I referred to another attorney I knew who was trying to make it on his own. While all that was going on, I spent a lot of time thinking about my life and my future. There was no realistic chance I could practice law again in Houston. Having an enemy as powerful as Roger Baker made me anathema to every other firm in the city. Trying to revive my own law practice was also a non-starter. Likewise, returning to the petroleum industry wasn't an option. Like I'd told Ray, the business had evolved, my experience was out of date, and my contacts had moved on. The good news was that, thanks to my settlement with Baker, I wouldn't have to worry about a job for the foreseeable future. So I opted to get out of hot, humid Houston and take a long vacation on a beach cooled by ocean breezes. After a little research, I picked the Pacific coast of Costa Rica. Why not relax on a beach, contemplating my future at leisure? Those plans should have made me happy. Instead, I found myself down. In fact, now that I thought about it, I'd been gloomy ever since the big showdown with Baker. Most people would love to be in your shoes. Why in the world aren't you? Part of the problem, I knew, was the end of my marriage. I didn't miss Raina. She'd very effectively shredded any feelings I'd once had for her. But I'd always seen myself having a spouse and family, and I couldn't help mourning the loss of that lifestyle. And that wasn't all I'd lost. After working hard to get through law school and then starting my own firm, I found having to forget about practicing law painful. Likewise, I'd also be leaving the city where I'd spent the last decade of my life, and the odds were good I'd never come back. With all those big life changes, I had valid reasons for feeling down. But I knew there was more to it than that. Something else was missing. I looked at the photos of Costa Rica again. It's so beautiful, so much to enjoy. I just wish I had someone to share it with. Then it hit me, and it's not just Costa Rica. I don't want to start my new life alone. I want to share it with someone special. The moment I realized that, I knew exactly who I wanted and immediately began cold feet. What if she doesn't want me? Why would she drop everything and go away with me? What am I going to do if she turns me down? I sat there arguing with myself, 1 minute trying to work up the courage to ask, the next trying to talk myself out of it. I've taken risks before in my life. I can do it again. Yeah, like changing professions in mid-career. That was a big risk and it didn't work out, did it? But that failed for reasons outside my control. Maybe so, but the gamble still failed. And what about starting my own law practice? That was another big risk, and it didn't work out either. That's true. I knew the odds were against me, but I was too stubborn to admit it. That one was all on me. But not every gamble I took failed. When I stumbled on Renee's little scheme to frame me for cheating, I gambled on turning the tables on her. That paid off big time. Yeah, but I was really lucky. Who says luck can't be good sometimes? Confronting Baker took guts, but I went for it and hit the jackpot. So why not take another chance, especially for something this important? I made my decision and went to my car. 2 days later, I was waiting near the ticketing area of Houston Hobby, standing on the decorative tile from the old airport. As I looked around anxiously, a feminine voice called out, "Robert, is that you?" I turned to see Mary Margaret Olson hurrying down the concourse toward me as fast as her fitted skirt would permit. "I'm so glad I ran into you," she breathed when she came up to my side and grabbed my arm. She glanced down at my rolling bag. "Are you headed out of town?" I nodded. "Yep, I've pretty much finished everything here, and I'm off for a long vacation." "Good for you. Everyone needs to get away once in a while. I wouldn't mind doing that myself." I wasn't sure if she was hinting, so I kept quiet. "I was sorry to hear about you and Renee," she went on. Her expression didn't show any sadness. "Don't be, it was for the best, trust me." I understand, she nodded. She glanced away for a moment. "You know, she told me she was cheating on you." "Oh, really?" I thought about that for a moment. Was that before or after you and I had lunch together? Now she was embarrassed. "Before. Why didn't you warn me?" She shrugged her shoulders helplessly. "I couldn't do that. She's my best friend." "I thought I was your friend too." She hesitated at my tone, then continued. "I talked to her a couple of weeks ago. I couldn't help myself." "So, how's she doing?" "Not well. No law firm in the city will hire her, so she's decided to move back home to McAllen and start her own practice." I didn't say a word. The look on Mary Margaret's face told me she was well aware of the irony. But I was still thinking about our little lunch date during the summer. "Tell me something, Mary Margaret, why did you want to have lunch with me?" Her smile grew coy. "I've always liked you, Robert. I figured if you and Renee weren't going to make it, I'd throw my hat into the ring early. She looked down at my bag. I could probably change my travel plans if you'd like some company. I stared at her coldly. Sorry, I've already asked someone who's more concerned about my well-being. She winced, but before she could say anything, I looked up. In fact, here she comes now. Mary Margaret looked where I was pointing and her eyes widened. Oh. She was walking across the concourse. When she saw me, she dropped her bag and ran towards me. A moment later, she threw her arms around me so tightly it was hard to breathe. Squire, she squealed happily. Then she hugged me and I didn't care about breathing. As I held her, one thought kept running through my mind. Thank goodness I went for it. 2 days earlier, when I had finally decided to take the risk, I grabbed my car keys and drove to the University of Houston. It had been several years, but I still remembered the way. Yet even as I headed northwest on I-45, I was still dealing with my insecurity. What makes you think she's interested in you anyway? She never said anything, and she hasn't tried to contact you since she went back to law school. Besides, she's probably in a relationship. Even if she's not, you're almost 10 years older. Why would she want you? Despite my anxiety, I exited the interstate onto Elgin, drove under the Alvin Freeway, and found a place near the law center to park. Then I walked nervously into the main entrance and asked the first student I ran into if she knew Madison Armstrong. Everyone knows Maddie, she told me. Right now she's probably in her legal writing class. She usually goes to the Commons afterward. If you wait for her there, you'll probably see her. I found the Commons and took a seat, watching the young future lawyers mingling about, chatting, checking their phones or ordering foot-long sandwiches from the little Subway in one corner of the room. As I sat there, I gradually became aware that I was getting scrutinizing glances, and I started to feel a little paranoid. What's going on? Do I look like a stalker or something? Is my zipper undone? As I grew increasingly uneasy, a young woman abruptly approached me. "Are you Squire?" she demanded. No, yes, well." She crossed her arms and glared at me, then turned and walked away before I could say anything else. What was that all about? The room began to fill with more students, and many of them lined the walls now. They seemed to be watching me, and I seriously considered making a run for the exit. Suddenly, there was a ripple in the crowd as the people at the end of the room made way. Then Maddie walked into the room and cautiously came towards me. She looked terrible. Her hair was limp, she had bags under her eyes, and her clothes seemed too big for her. When I stood up and took a step towards her, she shrank back, almost as if she was afraid. I didn't want to have a conversation in front of an audience, but it seemed like I had no other choice. Before I could speak, however, she asked, "What are you doing here, Squire?" In a voice so soft I could barely hear her. "Maddie, Renee and I are divorced now. We've sold our house, and I'm planning to leave town. But I wanted to see you before I go." A collective gasp followed from the students observing us, and then an angry murmur filled the room. Tears began to stream down Maddie's face. "I'm doing this all wrong," I thought. "You don't understand, Maddie. I saw Baker and worked out a settlement with him. I can't really talk about it, but I've closed my law office now." She hugged herself, protecting herself from what was to come. Why didn't I plan out what I wanted to say? I scolded myself. I know I'm doing this all wrong, but what I'm trying to ask is, well, is there any way you could come with me? "What?" she asked in a small voice. I shook my head desperately. "I know it sounds crazy, but what I'm trying to ask is, could we go away together, you and me?" I shrugged my shoulders helplessly. "I've been so miserable ever since you left, and I just thought that maybe." She whispered something I couldn't hear. I stared at her uncertainly. "What did you say?" "Yes, Squire." I said yes, she said loudly, and then she was in my arms, hugging me, and I heard a loud cheer. She pulled back slightly to look up at me. "I thought I would never see you again, and it was killing me." The loud cheer continued, and it was hard to hear her. I looked around and realized that the students were all cheering and clapping. 2 days later, I was worried you might change your mind, I said, holding her tightly in the airport. "Are you kidding? I've been completely miserable ever since I started back at law school. My grades dropped, I lost weight, everyone in my class knew something was wrong." She looked up at me, her eyes shining. "Then, when someone told me you were waiting in the Commons, I thought I was dreaming, but I didn't know if it was a good dream or a nightmare. When you asked me to come with you, I knew my good dream had come true." I've been miserable too, Maddie, and I couldn't understand why. At first, I thought it was the divorce and all the mess that came with it. But I finally realized how much I was missing you in my life. Well, it's about time. She scolded me with a mock-serious expression before hugging me again. Mary Margaret had been watching us with a disappointed look, and now she cleared her throat to get my attention. Well, it looks like I'm the third wheel here. Good luck, Robert, she said huskily before hurrying away. Maddie held onto my arm and pulled me close to her. Good, and don't you forget it. But before she left, she did tell me some interesting news about my ex-wife. After she was fired from Baker, Norton, no law firm in town wanted to hire her. So Mary Margaret said Renee's moving back to her hometown to start her own practice. Maddie laughed. Wow, talk about karma. Well, it serves her right after what she tried to do to you. Suddenly, she let go of my arm and pulled away in alarm. I left my bag back there. I laughed as she ran gracefully back down the concourse to retrieve it. Definitely an athlete, I thought happily. Then, arm in arm, we set off toward our gate. As we neared the check-in counter, I reached into my pocket to hand Maddie's ticket to her. That reminded me. I've got a couple of other things for you, I told her, and handed her a check. What's this? She asked. Those are your back wages for this summer. She looked at it, then back at me in confusion. Squire, you don't owe me anything for this summer. I agreed to work for nothing. I couldn't afford to pay you last summer, but I definitely can now, so it would be wrong not to do that. Then I handed her the second check, and her eyes went wide when she saw the amount. I don't understand, what is this for? You told me you were going to tap into your student loans so you could work for me. Well, this should be enough to pay off your law school debt. She stared at me with confusion, then her voice grew angry. Wait a minute, are you trying to buy me? I didn't agree to come with you because I wanted money. I led her over to a couple of empty seats and sat down with her. You took a leave from law school to come with me. The least I can do is fix it so you're not saddled with a bunch of student loans. She started to protest, but I put my fingers to her lips. Listen, Maddie, all I want is for us to be happy together, to enjoy each other without any worries. I'm not trying to buy you, Maddie. I'm just trying to secure a little peace of mind for the both of us, that's all. But where did all this money come from? Remember I told you I negotiated a settlement with Old Man Baker the day you came to say goodbye? Well, it was a very good settlement. How good? I lowered my voice. Between you and me, I got $5 million tax-free in exchange for not suing the firm and publicly embarrassing them. Her mouth dropped open. You can't say anything to anyone because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. But I can definitely afford to give you those checks, and we can enjoy ourselves together for a long time without having to worry about money. She looked at me a moment longer, then her frown vanished and she hugged me again. That's all I want too, Squire, to be with you. She looked a little embarrassed. Actually, I've wanted that for a long time. You know, I think I started falling for you the first week I began working at your firm. I didn't realize it at first, but I began having feelings for you too. I kept trying to resist because of Renee. I grinned. I guess that problem took care of itself. She hugged me again, and we sat there with our arms around each other until I glanced at the time. Hand in hand, we walked up to check in. The flight attendant on counter duty was smiling as she marked us off her list. You two lovebirds should be able to start boarding in just a few minutes, she told us. As we stood there waiting, Maddie looked at me curiously. You told me about Renee, but whatever happened with Hofmeister? Do you know anything about him? As a matter of fact, I do. After my divorce was final, I had to contact Old Man Baker to make arrangements for the firm's check to be deposited in my account. When I did, I asked him about Vance. Frankly, I think he wanted to tell someone what he'd done with Hofmeister. Anyway, he said he has Vance doing research for the firm in the Aleutian Islands. He also said he plans to bring the guy home when it's time for his wife to deliver their baby. But once mother and child are safely out of the hospital, Hofmeister will be off to his next assignment in Kazakhstan, up near the Siberian border. Maddie shuddered. Wow, that is one vindictive old man. Not that I feel sorry for Hofmeister. Just then the PA system announced our flight was ready to board, and Maddie and I started down the ramp together. The steward led us to our seats in first class and stowed our bags. Then he brought us each a glass of champagne as we waited for the other passengers to board. Maddie took a sip and sighed. I could get used to traveling like this as long as you're sitting beside me. Then she leaned over the armrest and put her head on my shoulder. Seeing her so happy made me feel better about my life than at any time in years. Then she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. You didn't mention Amber, whatever happened to her. Well, because she helped us so much. As part of my settlement, I got Baker to agree not to fire her. And he kept his word. She's still working for the firm, but they're keeping a tight leash on her. Maddie gave me that funny look again. You know, if you were going to ask anyone to go away with you like this, I'd have thought it would be her. I mean, she's so gorgeous and everything. I shook my head and smiled. Maddie, you're the one who makes me happy, not Amber. And unlike her, you're beautiful on the inside as well as the outside. She hugged me fiercely again. Good answer, Squire. Besides, I added, Baker told me something very interesting about Amber. Like what? You know how she took that money so her sister could have an operation? Yeah. Well, Baker told me Amber doesn't have a sister and she never repaid the money. Later that same day, I put my arm around Maddie's shoulder and we walked down to the water's edge. This is why I wanted to come to Costa Rica. It's beautiful. I'm so glad we're here. But it wouldn't be half so nice if you weren't here with me. Maddie, she pulled me even tighter and rested her head on my shoulder. We stood there in silence, watching the sun disappear in the Pacific.